hey, thank you for coming back. This is the second episode of Contrapologetics, where we take a look at problems with apologetics. So for this installment, I would like to address an apologist who has some significant influence and prominence. And I'm talking about Frank Turek, founder of Cross-Examine Ministries and perhaps best known for two books, one called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and the other, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. So Turek travels far and wide, speaking at churches and college campuses, and he gives talks based on these two books. And at the end of each, he usually does a Q&A session where people will get up and ask him questions, and those questions could be from atheists or fellow believers. And the reel we'll be considering comes from such a session. So let's take a look.
If God is such a loving God, does he allow everyone a chance to receive him?
So the question is, if there is such a loving God, does he allow everyone a chance to receive him? And this is a good and interesting question that leads to several interrelated issues. Now, we never do get to find out if this is a skeptic or a fellow believer voicing a concern. But the phrasing leads me to believe that this is probably a skeptic. And that is, he says, if God is such a loving God, then blah, blah, blah. And that seems fairly typical of skeptical language to say if God is such and such, or if God is such a great being, things like that. If this were a fellow believer, I might expect the phrasing to be something more like, if God is perfectly loving, then is it true that he gives everyone a chance, or something like that. Not that it's super important. Either way, I think it's important to consider a few things about this question, regardless of whether it's from a Christian or a skeptic. And that is, what is meant by receive God? What is meant by getting a chance? And what connection does that have to God being loving? So in answering these questions, it's important to note that Turek is an evangelical Christian who holds to the traditional view of hell. Any given human is either saved or unsaved. Now, the saved consist of those who have confessed Jesus as Lord and believe in their hearts that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that comes from Romans 10:9. And although Paul, the author of Romans, doesn't specify this within his writing, Turek takes it that these conditions, confessing and believing, must be met within the span of one's physical life. The unsaved, then, are those who have failed to meet these conditions in one's physical lifetime, and this results in their eternal suffering in hell. Wonderful. Okay, so within this framework, the idea of receiving God is shorthand for becoming one of the saved. One receives God in that one takes on a correct epistemic and attitudinal stance with respect to the gospel, which is the message of Jesus Christ. And many Christians take this to mean that one has entered into a personal relationship with God as he truly is. Okay, so next, to have a chance at receiving something, obviously, is to have an opportunity or to be in a position to accept or welcome or to take possession of whatever is being offered. So in this context, the question is whether for each person there exists a moment in time at which that person is in a position to correctly respond to the gospel, both epistemically and attitudinally. And I think this requires a few things: having sufficient grounds to believe there is a God, having sufficient knowledge and understanding of the gospel, and having sufficient grounds to believe the gospel is from God. Now, finally, how does this relate to God's love? Well, on the Christian view, to know God is basically the greatest fulfillment of one's own interests. And if God is loving, then God cares about the interests of those beings he loves. More than that, however, Christians like Turek believe that if one fails to receive God, one is not only missing out on the fulfillment of their greatest interests, but will suffer horrors unimaginable in hell. And of course, a truly loving being would be concerned about that sort of fate befalling the creatures it loves. Now, as mentioned earlier, the questioner appears, at least to me, to be a skeptic with something like the following implicit objection in mind. 1. If God is all-loving, then God wants everyone to receive him. 2, if God wants everyone to receive him, then God will give everyone a chance to receive him. But 3, it doesn't appear that everyone gets a chance to receive God. 4, therefore, it doesn't appear that God would be all-loving. And this, of course, would be concerning. Now, so far as I know, Turek accepts that unsurpassable love is part of God's essential nature. And as such, premise 1 and 2 are pretty much unassailable. So Turek is going to have to focus his apologetics on 3. So let's hear what he has to say about that and see if it's any good.
If God is such a loving God, does he allow everyone a chance to receive him?
Well, people that reach the age of accountability, he does.
Okay, so Turek here gives a qualified yes. He basically partitions humans into 2 complementary groups or sets. We have those people who have reached the age of accountability, and then we have the complement of that set, the set of all people who have not reached the age of accountability. And this means that for each person who has reached the age of accountability, God ensures that there exists a time at which that person is in a position to accept their gospel. Now, does this mean that people who have not reached the age of accountability don't get a chance to receive God? And of course, not necessarily. Now, of course, there are some hyper-Calvinists who claim that this is the case. But for Turek, this means that such people are not held responsible for making the decision to receive the gospel. Such people are automatically saved. Now, for Turek's view, this leads to the difficulty that dying prior to the age of accountability is absolutely preferable to reaching the age of accountability, and that's in large part due to his beliefs about hell, but that's a subject for another video. Now, from what I can tell, the age of accountability is somewhere between 10 to 13. However, I suspect that if Turek were pushed, he would think of the age of accountability not so much as a specific age, but maybe more of a stage of development or a matter of capacity. And this would take care of problems like what to do with, say, the mentally handicapped. All right, let's keep going.
It's undeniable that if there's a design, there has to be a designer. If there's a creation, there has to be a creator. So the Bible talks about the fact that we know God through his invisible qualities, which are clearly seen, so that men are without excuse. And we have this moral law written on our hearts. And so we know that this creator also puts moral demands on us, and we also know that we haven't met those moral demands. So everybody has creation and conscience. And the scriptures indicate that if you take a step toward learning more about that, God is going to get you the gospel so you can be saved. He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. But if you turn away from the light you already have, God is under no obligation to get you more light, nor it would make any difference because you're already turned away.
Okay, so what is this chance that everybody of accountable age gets? Since receiving God is an active sort of receiving, this requires that the person have at least some awareness of their need to receive God, as well as the means to do so. This in turn requires knowing, or at least having sufficient grounds, to believe that there is a God of a particular sort that can be known and can be received. Now, Turek seems to suggest that everyone's chance consists of at least 2 things: the ability to observe creation and the possession of a conscience. So let's start with the first one. What Turek has to mean here is that we observe the natural world, at least locally. And while the observable world would have to be a creation, Turek's case here hinges on our ability to tell that it's a creation. But can we tell this? Turek says it's undeniable that if there's design, there's a designer. If there's a creation, then there's a creator. Unfortunately, this isn't really helpful. What makes something like this undeniable is that it's essentially tautologous. In other words, it's just a truism. Something is designed insofar as it was the product of a designer, and something is a creation insofar as it was brought about by a creator. Now, the philosopher Daniel Dennett has a few things to say about design requiring a designer, but that comes down, I think, to some semantics that we don't really need to get into, so let's just give this one to Turek. By definition, design requires a designer and creation requires a creator. Okay, so what? So what? The question becomes, do we observe design, like actual design? Not just complexity, but do we actually observe design? Do we actually observe a creation? And if so, How do we know? Turek, of course, thinks the answer is yes, but how does he know? Is it because there are distinctive features of the observable world that definitively single out design or creation as the only reasonable explanation? Well, if there is, Turek doesn't appeal to it here. Rather, he appeals to the Bible. Specifically, he references Romans 1:19 through 20, which says the following: "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." And that's from the ESV. Okay, but even if we take this at face value, out of context, this just immediately raises the question, why should we accept what Paul says is true? He gives no more explanation or reasons or argument than Turek does. And it simply will not do to say that God inspired Paul to say it. Now, I don't know about you, but the more I study life and the observable world, the only thing that becomes more and more clear is that this life and this world is confusing as fuck. Clearly, many people have come to very different conclusions despite observing the exact same thing. And Turek's position seems to require the highly implausible and unlikely view that nearly everyone who's coming to different views than him is just somehow lying for no discernible reason. Now, Turek might respond that that reason is sin, but that would be a case of stupid apologetics, an answer just to have an answer. Many religions take sin just as seriously as Christianity does. Now, getting back to the verse in question, notice that Paul doesn't even say that we can tell the observable world is created. He just assumes it is. He also doesn't say that God's existence can be deduced from the natural world. He just assumes that God exists. He takes God's existence as a given. What he says is that whatever can be known about God is plain from what we observe. Note that some translations, like the NASB, say that whatever is known, as opposed to whatever can be known about God, is plainly seen. There are some interesting things to explore there, but we'll leave that to the translators. Now, someone could respond by saying that the existence of God is one of those things made known about God. But this doesn't appear to be what Paul has in mind, as God's existence wasn't even in question. So, at best, it seems all we can get out of Paul here is the following. Given the belief that God exists and that he created the world, there are certain attributes of God that can be deduced from observing the nature of the observable world. At this point, I imagine that Turek would respond by appealing to various cosmological arguments and teleological arguments for the existence of God, but these are hotly contested and by no means definitive. Not only that, but they're pretty advanced arguments, and so it'd be pretty absurd and silly to expect most people under normal circumstances to naturally reason out such arguments for themselves. But, Turek could say, people do naturally seem to believe that a god or gods or at least something transcendent exists when they observe the natural world. And this does appear to be the case. Humans throughout all of recorded history do appear quite prone to believe in the supernatural in one form or another. Of course, this fact can be readily explained without thinking that such beliefs are warranted, let alone obligatory. Suffice it to say that there doesn't appear to be anything that rationally requires one to believe that a theistic God exists. And this alone is enough to show that what Turek considers to be a chance or an opportunity for everyone is rather thin. But maybe we could say that everyone has the chance to consider that there might be a creator God, that this is just the start of the opportunity. And if people are considering whether such a being exists, what might they be able to deduce? According to Paul and Turek, anyone should be able to deduce God's invisible attributes and divine nature. Now, does this mean all of God's attributes or only some? We're not sure, but it's typical for Christians to think we know at least the following. God is unique, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is personal, God is morally perfect, unsurpassably loving, perfectly just, etc. Now, can any of these attributes be deduced from observing the natural world? I don't see how. What about the world would tell us that there's a unique creator or God? Many cultures have instead thought that there are many gods. So to what exactly can we appeal in the natural world that would rule out the world being, say, the product of a team effort of super beings? What about omnipotence? Many apologists like Turek talk about how powerful God must be to instantiate a world as vast as ours. But it really isn't ever clear what is meant by this type of power or being powerful. And even if we overlook the vagueness of this claim and admit the impressiveness of such a being who could bring our world into existence, would we be anywhere close to having to concede omnipotence? Turek and co. generally describe omnipotence as the ability to do anything logically possible. But bringing a universe into existence really doesn't tell us anything about whether there's an upper bound on what such a being could do. Maybe bringing a universe into existence exhausts the abilities of this being. Now, apologists also like to talk about how smart this being would have to be, how intelligent it would have to be in order to create a world like ours. And I see no reason to contest that. But no matter how smart this being would have to be, what would allow us to make the leap to omniscience, knowing every possible truth? Can one deduce that this being is perfectly moral, perfectly just, unsurpassably loving? Again, I don't see how. There are many aspects of this world that seem quite unexpected if it were the product of a being with those kind of traits. But most importantly, can one deduce that even if there is a creator, that this being can be personally related to? More specifically, that it is offering itself to be accepted in some particular way, and that failure to receive this offer will result in eternal suffering? If there is, that seems to require some God-level insight all on its own. So far, it isn't at all clear how the ability to observe the natural world constitutes any kind of meaningful chance to receive God. But Turek does say that humans have one more thing: a conscience. Turek says that we all have a moral law written on our hearts, that we know the being who made the observable world makes moral demands on us, and that we have fallen short of those moral demands. Again, though, do we actually know that? Suppose someone does conclude that the observable world requires a creator. What connects the same being to our conscience? Now, maybe you could say that being had to create our consciences, but maybe not. Maybe it just created the world and let whatever happen, happen. There's all kinds of possibilities. Turek offers nothing rigorous to suggest that this being would have to be the one giving us the demands. And even if we did come to conclusions like that, do we have any indication that our moral failings put us in need of salvation? What about those who, because of their consciences, like me, balk at the idea of blood sacrifice and eternal torment and eternal punishment? Now, in a strict sense, Turek's claim here seems blatantly false. Not everyone really has a conscience. There's not an insignificant number of people who either have no conscience or at least an extremely stunted one. And we know those people as sociopaths and psychopaths. But even in properly functioning people, consciences can and do vary widely. And even if one merely appeals to the fact that most of us have at least some idea that we do wrong things and we feel bad about them, it's not at all clear how anyone is supposed to tell the source of those things, or that they have anything really to do with a God to whom you must be rightly related in some relevant way to avoid eternal repercussions. So altogether, Turek seems to be saying that everyone has a chance to receive God in the sense that everyone can observe the natural world and everyone possesses this thing we call a conscience. But as we've just seen, it's not at all clear what these two things together should allow one to minimally derive about realities beyond the natural world. And I kind of think Turek is aware of the problem here because he kind of has a fallback that he goes to. And that is, whatever people are supposed to get out of observing the natural world or recognizing they have a conscience of some kind, Turek says that if the person takes a step toward what he calls general revelation, God is going to get them the gospel so that they can be saved. Now, observe how utterly vague that is. What the hell does it mean to take a step toward this general revelation? What counts? And since there are entire people groups who have gone without ever hearing the gospel, are we really to believe that absolutely no one in all of that time, in all of those people, in those societies or cultures or groups, absolutely no one took a correct step toward general revelation? Further, what does it even mean to get them the gospel? Does this just mean they get a chance to hear it? And if they do, are they expected to believe it on those grounds alone? What if the person is generally concerned and cares about the truth, but just isn't convinced by the ultra-specific story of the gospel? Further, what does it even mean to turn away from the light that someone is given? What does that even mean? Turek simply doesn't say. Now, I get that this is a Q&A, and so Turek doesn't have a whole lot of time to develop the ins and outs of this view or to lay out a bunch of the details. I get that. But it's quite irritating that he's using this as a piece of apologetics and he gives literally no indication whatsoever about what these things mean, how they're supposed to work. It's basically just a stock answer that gives the impression of dealing with a problem, an important objection actually, and I feel like this is pretty typical of apologists. Okay, so altogether, does Turek give a good answer to this person's question? I don't think so. It's basically a stock answer made to assuage concerns about fairness, which may work for believers, many of which are really just interested in having an answer, but I think a moment's reflection reveals it to be quite superficial and problematic. Now, much more could be said, and this is really just a start to a kind of dialectic, but I think what's been said so far should suffice. So tell me what you think. Did I miss anything? Do you have any pushback for me? Or maybe if you agree with me, do you have any objections or insights that you think I missed or you would like to elaborate on? Put them in the comments. And I would love to see your thoughts. So yeah, that'll do for now. And thanks again for watching. And bye.